Okay, this is part 4 in a 5-part series using content from Sean and Equist. The video today largely focuses on contemplative spiritual practices as a way of experiencing rest and good self-care, and as a solution to busyness and multitasking and saying yes to things that we don't need to say yes to. And so on our way there, I wanted to take us back to a text, Psalm 46, which at different times we've looked at before, but maybe take a fresh look at this text, because I think this would probably be one of the preeminent biblical texts calling for, depending on how we translate it, stillness or quiet or some type of contemplative posture before God. So we'll spend some time here in Psalm 46. So if you have a Bible, you might open it to Psalm 46. I'll have some of the text up here as well. This is the psalm behind the hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." And in some ways, it sort of colored the way that we look at the psalm, and we might miss some of the, more tender parts of the psalm because of the sort of militaristic song about it. But the theme to Psalm 46 is simply that the Lord is a refuge. Fortress is one of the ways that this gets translated. There are 3 verses that are sort of a repetitive frame here. Verse 1, God is our refuge. That can also be translated shelter, the Hebrew word, and my Hebrew is extraordinarily rusty, but it's something like masech. God is our refuge and shelter. And then a very similar idea is repeated in verse 7 and verse 11. Both of those verses use the same Hebrew word, which is slightly different than verse 1. The God of Jacob is our fortress. This is where the hymn comes from, a mighty. I see I missed the Y on the end of might. A mighty fortress is our God. But that word misgab in verse 7 and verse 11 can be translated refuge. It literally means high place. God is our high place. And so the image that the word brings to mind is something tumultuous happening down below, something dangerous happening down below, but God is a high place that we can go to escape the danger that's happening down below. I guess in a way, it makes me think a bit about the tropical storm and Hurricane Henri, and at least for those who are on the coast, they need to get to high ground, right, to escape the danger that the water and the tides represented. So this is really the theme of the psalm. God is our refuge. The God of Jacob is our fortress or refuge. The God of Jacob is our fortress or refuge. Repeated 3 times. And so that sort of then divides the psalm into 3 parts, each part coming back to this confessional statement. And as we'll see in the rest of the text here, this call or confession of God being a fortress or refuge or shelter is coming in the face of 2 dangers. So there's 2 dangers going on, imagined by the writer of the psalm here. One is a danger that's coming because of the sea and the mountains, and then the other is a danger that's coming because of the nations. By the way, I was just going to ask, any different translations on verse 1, 7, and 11, where God is our refuge, God is our fortress, God is our fortress? Anybody's Bible have anything different on those 3 verses?
NIV is fortress.
NIV is fortress. Okay. Everybody reading out of the NIV?
No. This is our strength.
Refuge and strength.
Refuge and strength.
Mhm.
Verse 1.
Yeah, strength in verse 1,
Yeah.
refuge in verse 7.
So, okay, what are you reading out of, Kathy?
NRSV.
Okay, yeah. So refuge. And in some ways, that may be a better translation than fortress. For us, fortress is kind of militaristic.
Right.
Okay, so let's just look at these three parts here, all tied back to this confessional statement that God is to be trusted. He is a refuge, a safe place for us. So this first part focuses on the danger of the sea and the mountains. So God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains at its swelling. Of course, it's easy to see sort of the tie to things like the earthquake in Haiti. We have mountains and oceans creating chaos here. This particular image is rooted in one way in the ancient world of looking at the universe called cosmology. And so there was this sort of basic worldview that pictured the cosmos as, and especially Earth, as the mountains sort of being the foundation that anchors the dry land, and the mountains also hold up the sky. So they're almost like pillars. And so these pillars anchor the dry ground, they keep the dry ground placed, and the mountains also hold up the sky. And so the worst case scenario would be if the mountains were tottering or moving, because then the sky falls and then the sea takes over, right? So what the author is envisioning here really would be the end of the world, that kind of stuff. I mean, this is every meteorite movie that's been produced from 1990 to the present. That's what he's imagining here, just total destruction of the earth. So, and yet even in that worst case scenario, the worst that life could ever get, there is the call to trust, this confession that God is our refuge and strength. Another way of thinking about this would be it's the undoing of what happened in Genesis chapter 1. So the author's picturing a season in the life of the world, the life of humanity, when Genesis chapter 1 is undone, and all of the order and the structure and the security and the predictability of the world is unwinding, unraveling. And even then, God is our refuge and strength. He says, verse 3, the waters roar. The word hama, meaning to moan, to growl, to growl. It's going to show up again in the text. So let's just stop there for a minute, see if we can sort of find any contemporary parallel to what the author is describing here. Can you think of any contemporary circumstances, whether they're literal or symbolic, related to this issue of the sea and the mountains, that might generate fear today?
Well, we happen to be coming up on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And the following December, I had a chance to sing at Lincoln Center, Messiah Singing, and there were 4 soloists, and I sang the bass aria about God is going to shake, I will shake the earth, the heavens, the sea, and the sky, thus saith the Lord. In a little while, I will shake the heavens and the earth. And when I was on that stage singing those people, I was picturing those buildings coming down, because that was like this colossal thing that none of us had ever seen. And the plume of debris and smoke of one of those buildings coming down, it looked like a hand. And it looked like a hand that was smashing that building and bringing it down.
Wow.
And that's what I saw, and that's what I imagined
Mhm.
in that moment, is just this horrific thing that was beyond any of our control. Like a volcano exploding or something like that. And that was,
Hmm.
that was my moment of feeling very, very small.
Yeah, yeah. Hmm. Yeah, that's a vivid description. Yeah.
Nuclear fears today with,
Hmm.
you know, I don't think we're as worried about that as we were 50 years ago. I'm not sure why. But just maybe we're used to it. It was new and extremely, life-ending kind of fear.
Yeah.
We're now, well, we felt that for 50 years. We move on. But the other, I've had a couple of conversations in the last week or two. Well, no, almost everything on Fox News is portrayed this way.
Hmm.
That's summarizing the conversations I've had with a couple of people. It's our imagining what's happening in Afghanistan, and actually it's not like just Fox News. You can go to MSNBC or CNN. You've got reporters sensationalizing everything that happens there. But it really seems to strike a chord with people, which is partly the result of how politicized we are in the country right now and the blame game we want to play on all this. But I also just think people really identify with the terror of people trying to escape, trying to catch a flight when your flight's been canceled. It's bad enough. But if you're in Kabul airport,
Yeah.
And are they going to squeeze me into the next cargo plane?
Mhm.
That's a whole, and who's behind the gates? And I think a lot of people here now are just really terrorized by that somehow, moved in a deeper way than I would have expected, because I don't really believe CNN or Fox or MSNBC or any of them. So I'm not quite as terrified. But when you're just watching the visuals on TV all day, I'm reading, but I think the visuals really have people worked up.
Yeah. So that feeling of something larger than life, more than we might have ever imagined happening. It's out of our control, causing chaos, pain, suffering.
And it probably ties into 9/11. Because it's the land from which it came.
Yeah.
I would say though that you contrasted this with the nations and in the sea and mountains. So to me, when you said that, I immediately thought of sea and mountains as kind of environmental. And so climate change and how we're experiencing, like, I can't imagine the people in Middle Tennessee who just got, the horrible things that happened to them. Like, I mean, they didn't have mountains falling on them, but they had, their land was shifting, the ground was shifting under them.
Absolutely.
There's no stability there. So, and the fires in the West Coast, and so all of that feels that sense of sea in the mountains. Also, like if we had a tsunami hit, in Japan, or if this past hurricane was bigger than if it was some of what was projected, we might have felt like the sea was coming after us.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, very good examples. Let me move to part 2 here. Trust in the face of the warring nations. So verse 4, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High, which is an interesting segue from the first part, where you have the seas, the water creating chaos and suffering, and now all of a sudden there's this river emanating from God, that's making glad the city of God. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage. The kingdoms totter. He utters his voice. The earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. So we've experienced cosmic instability, and now we are experiencing historical instability with the raging nations. The word rage in verse 6, the nations rage. That's the same word that was used earlier for the sea in verse 3. So the sea is now replaced by the nations that are warring. And the promise is that God is with his people or with his city. God is in the midst of her. God will help her when morning dawns. And as much as it's focused on the image of city, the call really isn't a call to trust in a place. It's not a psalm calling us to trust in Jerusalem, but it's a call to trust in a person. The author uses verse 7, the phrase, the Lord of hosts or the Lord of armies. And so here God is pictured as a divine warrior rising up against the nations who are at war. Anything come to mind as you think about contemporary circumstances, literal or symbolic, related to this idea of nations raging and the fear that brings? So we've touched on a few of those. Anything else come to mind around that image today?
Well, our nation is raging. And I think a lot of us were brought up with the notion of America, the beautiful, America, the extraordinary, Declaration of Independence, the founding documents, the idealism, democracy, republic, and all those things are true. But they never would stand up to the verdict of history. Now, we have some very specific ways they did not, like slavery would be one. But it seems that some of our countrymen people, can't handle America not being perfect. I mean, it deeply just settles them that ours is not the story of perfection. I still think the story is wonderful. It's a story of progress, but it's not a story of perfection. But some people don't seem to be so caught up in the cult of America that to puncture it just creates deep psychic wounds and which I think has something to do with the text we're dealing with.
Yeah. So there are ways in which we experience this just here in our own country. Yeah. Let me push forward to the third part, which continues this invitation to trust. So verse 8, come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. So the third refrain, God of Jacob is our fortress, our refuge, our high place. And most likely here, this invitation, come behold the works of the Lord and be still and know that I am God, is being extended not only to the people of God, the people of Zion, but also to all the nations that are raging. And so God is addressing all of humanity, all of the earth, with these commands to behold his works and to be still and know that he is God. So their power is nothing next to God's. So just as a way of summarizing, I think the image in the psalm is people who are afraid, they're in fear because they're unable to control what they dread, the roaring sea, the tottering mountains, the warring nations. Things are just completely out of their control. And as much as they'd like to manage that, they simply cannot. And then the image is also people in war who are using power and violence to try to collect whatever it is that they desire, another more land or more humanity to serve their interests or whatever it is that they're trying to gather. It's that forcible, violent acquisition of things. And in the midst of all of that, the call here is to trust. And primarily verse 10, to be still and know that I am God. So just to dig around a little bit in that, the word still, be still, rapa, is not just a call to relax. It's not just chill out or, take a seat by the pool. It's more literally stop. The word itself has different layers of meaning. To grow slack, and so to stop, to cease activity, to release or to let go. Some other places where this same word still is used, the Song of Songs, scarcely had I passed them when I found him, whom my soul loves. I held him and would not let him go. And that's the same word translated still in verse 10. It's the idea of letting go, letting something go. Or Deuteronomy 31:6 uses the same word, be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you. Same word translated still, the idea of releasing, letting go, surrendering something. And so the call here is to stop, to cease, and also to surrender, to let go of something and know that God is God. So Robert Alter, in his book, The Book of Psalms, the verb etymologically means to relax one's grip on something. It might be an injunction to cease and desist from armed struggle, to unclench the warrior's fist. At this juncture, which is the end of the poem, the eschatologically triumphant God speaks directly, declaring his supremacy over all the world. The poem concludes with the refrain, the Lord of armies is with us, a fortress, Jacob's God. So here's what I think is going on in this psalm, that this invitation to be still and know that I am God is an invitation for three things, really. It is an invitation to stop, to cease all activity, because there's been all this chaos that's going on, nature and humanity, and the call is to stop. Secondarily, to surrender all attempts to collect what we desire through power, through violence, through force, to surrender all attempts to control whatever is making us afraid, whatever we're dreading. And then third, to trust in God's capacity to be and do all that we'll ever need. I think that's what the author means by know that I am God. Instead of trying to acquire the things we think we need, instead of being afraid of the things that are coming against us, we stop, we surrender, we let go, we unclench, and we trust that God is ultimately all we will ever need, even in the face of overwhelming circumstances in our life. Stop all activity, surrender all attempts, trust in God's capacity to be and do all we'll ever need. Okay, so that's sort of some biblical foundation there behind a very familiar verse, be still and know that I'm God. We've practiced that a lot here at Stanford, but hopefully maybe expanding some of our understanding of it. Okay, so the biblical call is ultimately a call that what we might call contemplative, contemplative posture, where we're still, we're quiet, we're not active, And we're learning to surrender and to trust, to surrender and to trust, to let go. And so, two brief video vignettes here where Shauna Niequist talks about 5 practices that might flow out of, she never uses Psalm 46, but that might flow out of the biblical call for stillness, quietness, the cessation of activity, surrender. So she's going to talk about silence, centering prayer, and rest and Sabbath. And then the next one, Lectio Divina, and spiritual direction. Okay. So we're going to listen to this first one and then stop and talk, and then listen to the next one, stop and talk.
So one of the first ones that was probably the scariest for me, you've heard me talk so much about my love for speed and noise and chaos, that kind of swirling energy, that frantic way of living. What I found was that the most transforming spiritual practice for me was silence. And I've resisted it all my life. But as I began to tiptoe more and more deeply into the practice of silence, I mean, at first I could only do it for a couple minutes at a time. It freaked me out and it made me anxious. But the more I did it, the more it healed me and the less fearful I was. And the more I could think and feel and perceive more clearly. I feel like the ambient noise of my life went down and I was able to hear things I'd been missing for a long time. I started to be able to hear God's voice again, his voice of love, his voice of forgiveness. I started to sense the goodness of the world again, the beauty of creation. The stillness and the silence started to be my favorite place, as opposed to the scariest place. Mary Oliver is just my all-time favorite poet, and she talks about one day you knew the thing that you had to do, and all the voices were shouting their bad advice. Mend my life, they cried, but you strode deeper and deeper into the night, determined, and then something like, and as the stars burned, you strode deeper and deeper into the night, determined to save the only life you could save. That was terrible. Don't ever tell Mary Oliver that that's what I did to her poem. But for me, the symbol that connected with me in terms of silence were the stars. I've always been a person, like a city person, the buzz and the noise and the energy of a city. But then I found myself in this season so deeply drawn to the lake, to the country, to nature, to quiet. You can't see the stars in the city because of the light that humans have created. But out here at the lake, you can see millions. And so the stars became for me sort of a representation of choosing space and stillness and silence. And so I wear this star necklace, and it reminds me, you're strong enough to stand alone in silence. You don't have to be afraid of it anymore. The next thing that really helped me was the practice of centering prayer. And again, I'm not an expert. I'm like the babiest of all babies, but I love it. And what you do essentially, and a lot of people do it different ways. Father Thomas Keating is sort of like the boss of it, the expert of it. And so you pick either an image or a word about God or one of his names in scripture or an attribute of his, and you picture it in your mind. And every time your mind wanders or your heart wanders, you just return it back to that image and you let God whisper to you through your mind, through your body, into your heart, who he is. And a friend of mine says that when you practice it, you find your mind wandering, you let it wander, you don't scold it, you just wander it right back to that image. And so for me, I always picture a red heart, like a little cartoon heart. And what it says to me is the center of everything is love. The thing that God is more than any other thing is loving. And when I focus deeply on that love, I'm able to live with freedom, without fear, without anxiety. The practice of rest really has been a tricky one for me. Again, I like to be fast, I like to be busy, I like to go and go and go, and I have an endless list of tasks and things and adventures. But rest has become one of the most healing and restorative practices. A friend of mine says that Sabbath is when we remind ourselves that we're not God and that the world doesn't depend on us to keep spinning. And I still have a long way to go in learning the practice of Sabbath every week, but I feel like I'm starting to taste it in small ways. I used to do a thing that I call fake resting. And it's essentially like if you looked in our windows at our house, which would be weird, so don't, but if you looked in our windows, you would see like Aaron laying on the couch and the kids playing quietly, and I'm like in my jammies, drinking my coffee with my messy ponytail, and it looks like I'm resting. But I'm not resting. I'm running laps around our house, gathering up toys, folding laundry, making lists, making lunches, defrosting things from the freezer, sorting things out. I'm managing the stuff of our life in a frantic way, but it looks like resting because I have my pajamas on. That's not rest. I'm learning to rest, to believe that God is in control of all things, that it doesn't depend on me, and that to stop and rest my body is actually a very responsible and loving thing to do, because it allows me to connect with the most important people in my life.
Okay, let's just pause for a moment and talk about silence. All three of those practices are practices of silence. She talked specifically about silence, centering prayer, basically being prayer without words, where we are wordless before God. And then finally, Sabbath or rest. So the cessation of activity, even the cessation of words, and just being before God. What role does silence play in your life in a positive way? What role does silence play in your life?
I might say that this is odd. I might say it keeps me out of trouble. There's things that, that I want to say, but I'm better off not saying them. I'm probably better off not even thinking them, but silence will get me through that.
Yeah. That can be a very intentional spiritual practice of silence.
I appreciate that. And I need to employ that more.
What role does silence play in your life?
I don't mind continuing. It could also be restful. I mean, silence is restful. You listen, I'm not sure about this entirely, but I might say it doesn't take all that much energy. Just be silent.
Can anybody, does anybody connect with, in the video, she talked briefly about sort of fear of silence, being afraid of silence. What's scary about silence to you?
I'm afraid that I don't fill my silence well. It's not a refuge. It's a place of terror a lot of times. I just in the last year or so, maybe COVID, I don't know, but I have a lot of trouble sleeping, and I'm awake in the middle of the night a lot of times, and I can't go back to sleep. And I spend an hour or two generally, and everything is darker, everything is worse. When, the sun comes up, and I finally usually fall back asleep before, in like around 6 a.m. or something. And the sun makes, the light makes everything less terrible. It's not that it went away, but it's less terrible, and there's good things in it. But honestly, I would love to say I fill my silence with good things, but right now I'm not very good at that.
Mhm. Mhm.
I would have to agree. I tend to get anxious about things in silence rather than, I do much better if, I play music, or I, listen to a podcast or stay busy with work. But if there's just silence, I tend to think of negative things. And
Yeah.
my anxiety increases.
Yeah. Sometimes silence can magnify what we're feeling inside. And that's the last thing we want, is for that feeling to be stronger. Yeah.
I've known people who tried different forms of meditation. And these people I've known my counseling practice, and I've had a couple people say that they actually have panic attacks when they tried to meditate.
Really? Yeah.
That moment of feeling that sense of emptiness
Mhm.
was, it created a panic attack.
Mm.
So it
Yeah.
could be very real.
It is very, very real. Yeah, it is. So let's remember the invitation of Psalm 46 to be still, to cease activity. So that maybe there's activity that's unhealthy in our lives, or that may be causing anxiety. To cease activity, to surrender, and here's where the real challenge is: to let go of, to unclench, let go of what's either causing fear or driving us to an insatiable quest for more, and then to trust.
Chris,
Yes.
can I make a small comment?
Yes.
Yeah, all this stuff we're talking about, for some reason, I don't know why, I was trying to find it in my Bible, but I'm thinking of the situation with Jesus is in the boat with his disciples, and a storm comes, and they get all nervous and upset because he's falling asleep in the back of the boat. And he says, and they say in so many words, don't you care about us? And then he calmed all the waters and all the seas and everything like that. So I don't know, that story's coming to my mind for some reason.
Yeah, I think that's a really good connection, Robert. And you remember what Jesus says? He says, peace, be still. Peace, be still. So not exactly the same word in Psalm 46:10, but I think there's definitely a way of connecting those two dots there. Jesus commanding peace, be still, God calling us to be still. Okay, let's watch this last video vignette. So she's going to talk about Lectio Divina, spiritual direction. Again, different expressions of stopping activity, being quiet, surrendering.
Lectio Divina is probably something some of you have done. And again, it's something I started doing in college, actually, when I went to an Episcopal church then. And then something I've picked back up in recent years, and then something we do quite often at the practice. And essentially, you're taking a segment of scripture and you're focusing on it. So if centering prayer is an image or a word, Lectio is a verse over and over and over. And as someone reads it over you, or as you read it, you're asking God all the time, what new word or thought are you teaching me about who you are through this phrase, through this verse? It's slow and it's quiet And it's sometimes difficult. And I'm finding that most of the most effective practices are. They're slow and they're quiet. And for someone as flaky and fast as me, they require a lot. But they also transform a lot. The last practice that for me has been so meaningful is the practice of spiritual direction. In some ways, I picture it sort of like training wheels for prayer. So I can say I'm going to pray on my own, and I do, but when Mary sits with me in her little office in this Jesuit retreat center bordered by horse farms, and she puts a hand on mine and she says, let's talk with the risen Christ. Let's tell him how we feel. Let's tell him what's going on in our lives and in our hearts. Let's be with him. Let's let him remind us of his love for us. Mary's the training wheels that keeps me from just like doing it for 3 minutes and then going off to watch a show. She's the person that sits with me, that protects this holy space, that invites me into new ways of prayer, and it has changed so much inside of me. The first couple times, I think I cried for an hour straight because she was inviting me into a way of relating to Jesus that I longed for, that I hadn't done for a long time. Those narratives of him being angry or ashamed of me not living up to his expectations, built so much distance between me and the person of Christ. And Mary helped me shore up that distance. She took me by the hand and she brought me to a Jesus, not the one that I had been experiencing for all those years, shaming and scolding, but a Jesus with love in his eyes, who would sit, who would carry my burdens, who cared about every part of my life. And in that little upstairs office, that space became sacred space. God used Mary to reshape my view and my understanding of him, and therefore my ability to connect with him.
Okay, so Lectio Divina being a way of reading scripture that is slow, thoughtful, and going deep with a small amount of text rather than trying to read as much as we possibly can, pulling out commentaries and devotional books. And then spiritual direction being really a recognition that sometimes it's hard for us to be still and know that I'm God without the help of another person. Sometimes we need another person to lead us into that stillness, to help us to truly experience that God is God, someone who can help us to surrender. And that's in some ways what a spiritual director does. So I hope what you take away from tonight is you still know that I am God. I hope you take it in a sort of broader sense than just relaxing, but finding ways this next week to stop activity, to surrender, unclench those fists, and to trust that God is indeed a refuge and a high place for us. Any closing comments or questions?
I like that. I like that list.
Thanks. Thank you. All right, I'll leave the Zoom session open for a few minutes if you guys want to chat. And thanks for being with us tonight. Happy birthday, Joanne. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, Chris.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
No. Oh, okay.
Good to see everybody.
Oh, I've already answered it. It's waiting for you. Okay. Can you remember roughly? It's like $3,400 or something like that. But I spelled it out.
Okay, people who are more.
Yeah, of course I
Yeah,
did.
we've been on it. Okay, Made a connection. Definitely. Shelter on Friday afternoon, for work, which is down at Harbor Point. Okay.
Penny, is Mike with you?
She says, I'm interested.
Oh,
I was just
looks like she's frozen.
She thought we'll send you
Hmm.
text every time.
I saw
I said,
this.
"Why do that?"
I'm like, where's she getting that?
Someplace it's not, it's nowhere, anywhere.
I know, but maybe Mark.
Did you get my email?
About. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Friday is better.
Well, and I tell you that my phone bill is a little bit higher than expected because, I never called internationally,
That's not
for
us.
certain
That's Chili's.
Anywhere.
We don't have a Chili's anymore.
Well, yeah, in my itemized list, yeah. Yeah, and-
Well, I'd like to be there, but.
Yeah, so her link is not very much. So go
Go
back to her email.
Like I tell you.
Did she give you the
Yeah,
address?
but when I
Did she
saw
give you
that, I
the
said,
address?
let's just
She
get
said,
some
"This
chart.
is my office building, she can't wait."
Because I've been keeping it.
Even so, I just have to text her back and say.
And it's not pulling up the right thing. It's not anything.
Yeah, I saw it. I mean,
She's like.
yeah. Well, yeah. Because I mean.
She is
Mike still
young.
covered half of it.
She's young.
Take the pressure off us.
I mean, Mike covered half of it because of the money
Yeah,
that
that's
Earl
what
got
I
out of
said.
his
Yeah.
account. See, there's
Yeah,
some,
yeah.
there's some.
Yeah,
more-
he's worked.
There's
so
more
he's
there being
worked
paid
for
into that
6
account
years
from
as a
like
nurse.
Mike's
So,
retirement or something, but see, Earl was not wanting to touch that
Yeah.
because
And
Mike was
he
dead.
I'm thinking early
So he
30s, but
had-
he could
he had-
be late 20s.
Well, I mean, it goes into that account, but Earl doesn't want to touch it any longer than that. I mean, because Michael was still getting paid. Well, right, but they need.
I was gonna ask you, I saw your email.
That's why.
So Kelly's asking for someone to do
Yeah.
the children's class, but I'm doing
Right.
nursery again this week. I did nursery last week.
I think we're more concerned
So-
about the 12.
It's weird. You know,
That's what
he's a balding 43-year-old man with a beard.
Volunteer.
But he still has that Earl smile.
On the
you know,
emails.
and that-
But
and that-
anyway,
that-
I was
that
gonna
humor,
ask you,
And instinctively, when he
So,
first started getting in touch with me, I never call him Earl.
have you ever split things up and like had one person responsible for each thing? Like, I would
What was your
like to
concern?
take nursery,
Yeah.
and just be responsible for nursery from now on.
Assigning that. Yes, we have done that.
I wouldn't mind doing it that way, and I'd be glad to take.
Good night, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Then we'll take it out of that, whoever, and then Kelly could just be in charge. See,